Real quick before we start the video, guys, I have a business email down below. So if you want to send me some mail, it could be Russian food, it could be food from different places. Please email me down below and you will get an address so you can send it. And if you have any business opportunities, please down below, just write me. I'm always answering. So enjoy the video. What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to Jellygoon TV. Welcome back to all you beautiful people on YouTube. Thank you so much for clicking on this video. I really do appreciate you. Now, we're going to return back to some videos ago. We had something about Otto von Bismarck or something like that, and we only reacted to the first part. So you know what? We're gonna take the whole part. So without further ado, let's get into Otto von Bismarck, a man of great ideas, extra history too. So Otto von Bismarck was a strange little dude. Like, he was amazing, but I can only remember a little bit because there's many videos that I reacted to, but it's gonna be nice to learn about him again. So let's just get into it. Let's go.
1848. The People's Spring. Springtime of Nations. The year of revolution.
Shit. Otto von Bismarck is a revolution, I think. I don't know.
Bismarck's political life ended nearly as abruptly as it started. For as the summer of 1847 began, the king, unable to get a railroad grant from the Diet without also granting a constitution, threw his hands up in the air, dissolved the Diet, and sent everybody packing. Bismarck went back home to his estate, finally completed that whole business of getting married, and went on his honeymoon.
Nice.
But as he traveled Europe, and when he returned home, he noticed a strange tension in the air. An unrest in the streets, in the cities.
It's the
Then,
revolution.
in February 1848, Paris erupted. The monarchy fell. A republic was re-established in France. Bismarck was concerned. At home and abroad, he had seen the strain between the working class and those who ruled, but he never expected something so abrupt or so successful to happen in France.
Sure.
Then
That was
Vienna
actually
fell.
this, but
Metternich, the great Austrian statesman and architect of the Concert of Europe, was displaced. This opened up an opportunity, as the Austrians had long been the dominant force among German states. But it also served as a warning. It was clear that revolution was coming to Prussia soon. But Bismarck worried that the king was too weak and too vacillating to put down a revolution. And he was right. As word of the revolution in Vienna spread, Prussians took to the streets, and soon the king promised them a constitutional government. But as the people were celebrating their victory in Berlin, the celebration turned into a clash. Shots were fired. Government troops killed revolutionaries. Many, including Bismarck, believed that now there was no choice but to crush the revolution. The king, though, disagreed, and ordered the troops out of Berlin, effectively leaving himself hostage to the revolution. And then came the first of Bismarck's good-ish ideas. He raced back to his estate and organized an old-school peasant levy. Yes, in the middle of the 19th century, he tried to press his peasants into service as their feudal lord in order to put down a revolution whose stated goals were to enfranchise and empower those same peasants. With this great idea in mind, he handed them all shotguns and said, "Come on, lads, to Berlin." But just as they were storming off, one of his spoilsport neighbors came out and told him to stop hurling a firebrand into the country, threatening to talk the peasants out of this nonsense. Bismarck politely replied, "You know that I am a quiet man, but if you do that, I shall shoot you." So with revolver in hand and four bullets in his pocket, he led his feudal levy to go liberate the king.
Yay.
Unfortunately, when he got to the first army
they
camp,
already
which
took
was
over.
staffed by many of the conservative officers that he had come to mingle with after making his fiery speeches in Berlin, he was promptly told, "Yes, we are all a bit disappointed right now, but no, we really don't want your peasant mob messing this up even more. So how about you go send your peasants back and bring us some corn and potatoes or something?" Not content to serve as mere fodder provider for the army, Otto then had his second good-ish idea. He left his estate and tried to sneak into Berlin again, with the cleverest of ruses, trimming his beard. Needless to say, many people saw through his incredible mind games, and soon he was laughed out of Berlin. But Bismarck was not done. He had a third good-ish idea. With the king making ever greater concessions to the revolutionaries, Bismarck saw it as his place to help elevate one of the king's relatives to the throne. So Bismarck went all in on trying to replace King Frederick Wilhelm with a confusingly but more succinctly named King Wilhelm. But Wilhelm had legged it to England, and he wasn't going to listen to this wild man anyway. So Bismarck began to hunt for a new candidate. Soon he found another royal relative named Charles, who proposed that his even more confusingly named son, Frederick Wilhelm, should replace Frederick Wilhelm on the throne. This Frederick Wilhelm, or Fritz,
the same name, seriously,
was 6 years old.
Wow. Oh, he's 6 years old. Oh, yeah, of course. Have a king at 6 years old.
They eventually did, but more as an afterthought, with Bismarck awkwardly meeting her in her servants' quarters. Not asking turned out to be a mistake, though, because Fritz's mom supported the liberals and put the kibosh on the whole thing. It would seem that Bismarck had made an enemy of the mother of this 6-year-old he was put on the throne.
That's crazy.
Nonetheless, he was soon summoned for the Second Prussian Diet, which the king had ordered assembled to hammer out how to make a real parliament for Prussia. There, Bismarck spoke passionately about the noble past that they were so casually throwing away, even becoming choked with emotion and having to stop mid-speech. But to no avail. The Diet did its job and created the Prussian National Assembly,
of course,
which Bismarck was very not.
The people have spoken.
This Prussian National Assembly pushed for a real parliamentary system along British lines, though, and soon the king began to lose patience with the body. So Bismarck joined the Camarilla, which was not, in fact, a secret society of vampires which has kept their presence hidden from humanity for hundreds of years, though I can understand your confusion, and let's be honest, Bismarck would have made a great vampire, but no. Bismarck joined the much more boring, but real, group of nobles and courtiers close to the king, who were determined to maintain the power of the monarchy through non-vampiric means.
But somebody's gonna stab him in the back.
Let's go ahead and call this one Bismarck's first actual
good idea.
Because this put him in contact with many powerful men. But even though, by all accounts, he was an effective member of the society, and even though he had amplified the conservative voice in Prussian politics by establishing a newspaper, when the liberal cause fell apart and the conservatives once again became ascendant, he was passed over for a cabinet position. They were very happy to use him when a radical was needed, but once the time came to reestablish order,
get away. We don't need
was cast aside. So Bismarck returns to his estate to witness the birth of his first child. But Bismarck had a plan. Bismarck always had a plan.
Yeah, we heard that
before. Even though the liberals had failed to get anything like the constitution they had wanted, they had gotten a constitution, and with it, a parliament, the Landtag. And Bismarck, always a pragmatist under whatever colors he may have worn, decided to get himself elected to this new body. The fight was fierce. He knew that he wouldn't get elected in his own region, so he decided to run for office in the city of Brandenburg.
Of course he did.
There he was an outsider, running against the local mayor.
Of course.
He acted with vigor, describing his campaign headquarters as a military camp, with messengers running in and out at all hours, and strategy being formulated so that he never missed an opportunity to speak to the few hundred men who would eventually determine the representative for Brandenburg. He won by 25 votes. Now he was once again at the center of things, and the question at hand on everybody's mind was the unification of Germany. If the 39 German states that had survived the Napoleonic invasion banded together, they could change the face of European politics forever. But how to achieve that was a matter of some debate. They could either come together under Austria or under Prussia. But Austria rejected the possibility of unification
we don't want
because
that.
The Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Habsburg-inherited lands included far more territory than just the German portions. And the whole point of unification was German nationalism. Germans would never accept rule by a sovereign who was also ruling over other nations. This meant that the Austrians would either have to divide their empire and give some other branch of the family their German territories, or simply reject unification outright. And they chose the latter. The German National Assembly, which was different from the Landtag in that it represented all German states, decided, with little other choice, to offer the imperial crown to Frederick Wilhelm. Nobles in the Landtag, including Bismarck, urged him to accept. But the king rejected the proposal, and this allowed Bismarck the opportunity to rail against the constitution that would have come with it. He was blasted by the press, and sure of losing his seat in the next election. But when the king dissolved the Landtag, he changed the election rules for the next session in ways that favored landowners like Bismarck, which ensured his re-election. After giving some blistering speeches on the role of the monarchy and some strong invectives against even the monarch's own move toward a constitutional unification, Bismarck got himself moved to the new assembly debating the question of unification. But before that could go anywhere, he got caught up in the next great conflict. The war over territory seemed to loom between Austria and Prussia, and it is here that we see the evolution of Bismarck. Because though in many ways he was and always would be a man of war, when a settlement was offered and many pushed to reject it and go to war instead, Bismarck rose and said, "It is unworthy of a great state to fight for something which does not concern its own interest. Gentlemen, show me an objective worthy of war, and I will go along with you."
Okay.
It is easy enough for a statesman to ride the popular wave from the comfort of his own fireside, making thunderous speeches from the rostrum, letting the public sound the trumpets of war, and leaving it to the musketeer, bleeding out his life's blood in the snowy wastes to settle whether policies and
I'm getting
glory
goosebumps
or
now, man.
failure.
Stop that.
Nothing is simpler. But woe to any statesman who, at such a time, fails to find a cause of war which will stand up to scrutiny once the fighting is over. And so begins the transformation of Bismarck the Radical to Bismarck, man of realpolitik.
Oh, nice. Wow, that was a nice video, man. That was very beautiful. I really did like that, man. But he was a odd fella. Like, he was in many things. Like, he didn't never give up. That's the first episode we saw. I can remember he never gave up. He never gave up because his land was special and he never really gave up. Like, he got so many opportunities and life just, it skanked him everything. It gave him everything. You know what I mean? Like, there's some setbacks for him, but life comes around. It is what it is. Today we're gonna continue the series on Otto von Bismarck, Iron and Blood, Extra History Part 3. So let's just get into this one and see what it's all about again. He's a determined man and he knows what he wants. So let's see it. Let's go. Let's see the transformation.
As Bismarck moved from radical to pragmatic, he was at last offered a position in which he would shine. The position of envoy, diplomat, and deal maker. Bismarck's tutelage in the diplomatic craft was swift. As he wrote to his wife, "I am making rapid progress in the art of using many words to say nothing at all."
What?
He wrote this
Okay,
from
that's
Frankfurt.
honesty.
He had been assigned as the Prussian envoy to the Diet of the German Confederation, that being the body that was supposed to figure out how the whole mess of 39 German states were to work together.
Okay, of
but
course.
Working with the Austrians was the furthest thing from Bismarck's mind. He was there to assert that Prussia was Austria's equal, and he did this with aplomb by lighting a cigar. See, smoking in the assembly was a privilege granted only to Austrians, but when the Austrian representative sitting next to him took out a cigar and began to smoke, Bismarck cracked out one of his own and, saying nothing, lit up. The press loved it. His enemies loved it too. When he returned to Berlin, one of them claimed publicly that the only thing Bismarck actually accomplished in Frankfurt was burning a cigar. And, of course, because old habits die hard, one thing led to another, and the ever-diplomatic Bismarck found himself once again on the field of honor, trading shots with a fellow Prussian over a cigar burnt to snub the Habsburgs. But his time in Frankfurt taught him one thing. If the Prussians were ever to carry the same weight amongst the German states as their much larger rival, they would need allies. So he began to court what he saw as the two most valuable possible confederates for Prussia, Russia and France. But then, in October of 1857, the King of Prussia suffered a stroke. The king's brother, named Wilhelm, because of course he was, why should a family have to come up with more than one name, took over the leadership.
True fact.
This Wilhelm, though, considered Bismarck as nothing more than a petulant schoolboy. His words. Bismarck had a plan, though. Bismarck always has a plan.
He's like a fucking psychopath.
In a most un-Bismarckian and therefore
not Bismarck
most
way. Okay, so he didn't go that way.
He delivered to the prince a 92-page treatise detailing exactly how Prussia could abide by the letter of the agreement they'd signed that founded the German Confederation, while simultaneously aligning the other German states against Austria. Unfortunately, Wilhelm thought that was stupid. Bismarck was promptly assigned as the Prussian envoy to the Tsar, because, I guess if you want to get rid of somebody in 18th century Europe, you just put him in St. Petersburg, or better yet, Moscow. And there he would sit on ice until 1862. These were some of the bleakest years of his life. He was cut out of state affairs, he fell ill, he nearly lost the use of his leg, and even withdrew himself from Russian society as his ability to serve as a diplomat was hindered by the fact that everybody knew he was there because his sovereign didn't want him in Prussia. But, at last, a strange letter came, one saying that he should return to Berlin with haste. When he got there, against all odds, he was asked to serve as the head of government. You might reasonably ask, why? Why would the king who had so
Exactly.
long snubbed him ask him to run the state?
That makes
How
no
could he go
sense.
from
There's
a
something
remote
about it,
diplomatic
man.
posting to the head of domestic affairs? Well, because nobody else wanted the job. At least nobody else the king thought would plunge the country into civil war.
Oh, okay.
You see, for a year, the Liberal Party had refused to grant funds for the army. And if you know anything about Prussia, you know Voltaire's old adage. Where some states have an army, the Prussian army has a state. Meaning that not funding the army had brought them to the brink of constitutional crisis.
Yeah.
And the king's closest advisor's best suggestion was to have the army overthrow the Democratic Assembly and then figure it out from there.
Yeah, exactly.
Which was basically 100% guaranteed to start a civil war. So the king figured, call in Bismarck, I guess. If he succeeds, fabulous. If he fails, then we'll just throw him under the anachronistic bus.
Yeah, true.
As the announcement went out, no one in the wider world of Europe really thought he had a chance. Neither did many in Prussia. For 2 weeks, Bismarck had to scramble to pull together a cabinet, because nobody thought his government would last. Simultaneously, he also had to bolster the spirit of the king, who, in his dejection, was continuously on the brink of giving in. And in the midst of all of this, almost as an offhand remark to those who were debating funding the army, he said the words that would define him and define the age. The great questions of the day will be decided not by speeches and majority votes, that was the great mistake of 1848 and 1849, but by iron and blood. But in the midst of all the chaos, Bismarck had a plan.
Again,
Bismarck
always has a plan.
If he couldn't get to the Landtag to do what he wanted, well, then he would just have to do what he wanted anyway. You see, the king and the parliament were supposed to agree on any new budget before the government could collect taxes on that budget and do with them whatever they wanted. Everyone else took this to mean that the government could not collect taxes without parliament's approval. But Bismarck had other ideas. See, the Constitution didn't really spell out exactly what the government was supposed to do if the king and the parliament couldn't agree on a budget. So Bismarck just said, well, we don't have a new budget. Guess we have to keep collecting taxes based on last year's budget. And so sent out the king's tax collectors to do what they did best. For nearly half a decade, the government would continue to collect the 1861 budget, and the king would have a stream of revenue without asking Parliament for a thing. With that settled, Otto now had the prestige and the freedom to turn to what he saw as his larger project, positioning Prussia to be the preeminent power in Germany when the German states finally unified. He moved rapidly. First, he checked in with France to see if they would stay neutral, or perhaps even join Prussia if an armed conflict broke out between them and Austria. Then he wooed the smaller German states to begin voting with Prussia, even as he was baffling the Austrians with an alternating volley of threats and lofty promises about how much they could accomplish together. But even as he was holding his own in German affairs, his zeal abroad nearly cost him his ministry. A rebellion had broken out in Poland, and the Russians were eager to quell it, already sending in troops. Bismarck immediately dispatched Prussian divisions to the Polish border and sent a note to Russia basically saying, "Hey guys, we can totally help you with that." Soon, protests over this action broke out from the other major European powers, with France, Great Britain, and Austria all condemning Berlin. Many thought that Bismarck would have to resign over this, but the king, the very same one who had exiled him to Russia before, refused his resignation. Soon, Europe's ire turned from Berlin to St. Petersburg, and while the matter would blow over in time, to the Russians, this unification of the European powers against them brought to mind the recent and disastrous Crimean War, and in doing so, reminded them just why having an ally in Prussia might be valuable.
Yeah, true.
But just as this affair was being put behind him, his great project was again in jeopardy. The Emperor of Austria had invited the Prussian king to a congress of princes to discuss the matter of German unification. Bismarck at once saw that the Austrians had stacked the deck, and any vote at such a conference would go in their favor. But he also knew that he wouldn't be able to convince the king that an invitation from other princes was a trap. So he took a different approach. The king was never the most secure of people, so Bismarck convinced him that the invitation was an insult, and that it should have been sent to him with much more formality. So the king declined to go. But then, days later, the King of Saxony rode up, bearing another invitation imploring the prince to come. Now he had been formally asked to attend by 30 princes with a king as the message bearer. There would be no convincing good old Wilhelm that this was a slight. Instead, in a meeting full of shouting, imploring, and not a little sobbing on both sides, Bismarck convinced the king that he would be giving up the independence of the Prussian army if he agreed to anything at this conference.
What?
And so, with Bismarck
This guy's
ripping
good
off
at
the door
talking,
handle
man.
on the way out, once again, the king declined to attend. With that, the course was set. The initial threats were in check. Now, at last, Bismarck could truly begin his project of iron and blood.
That's crazy. Wow. That is crazy. This Bismarck guy is a crazy one, man. I gotta say, man. He's really crazy. Like, he will to explode soon, man. But, yeah. Let's just get into the other one. This is number 4. So let's just get into it and see what it is all about, man. Bismarck he's a dog, man. He does what he wants to do. So, yeah. Let's just get into it. Let's go.
It is go time in Bismarck land. Bismarck had a list, and he was checking it twice.
Christmas man
Action
now.
item number 1 on that list, steamroll some Danes. 16 years prior, in
Hey!
1848, Prussia had
That's
invaded
racist.
Denmark with the hopes of annexing the largely German-speaking duchies of Schleswig and
fuck
Holstein.
you.
But the
Yeah, that's
threat
where I
of
live.
international intervention had sent them packing. Now it was time for
Of course they
revenge,
packing.
or at least a very pragmatic seizure of territory. You see, the Danish king had just cacked it, and as basically always happens when a European king checks out, his death left everybody scrambling over the succession. And in this case, that scramble was played out between one staunchly Danish branch of the family and one sympathetic to the Germans. When the Danish group won out, they
Hell yeah.
decided that it was high time to rule Schleswig and Holstein directly, to finally incorporate them
That's
into
where I
the
live.
kingdom of
That's,
Denmark,
Schleswig.
not to leave
That's
them
where I
as
live, man. That's the
semi-independent
south.
duchies with
It's the
their
south
own
of
weird
Denmark.
rules and privileges. This violated a treaty the Danes had signed with the Prussians, though, and gave Bismarck his chance. But it also made things tricky. After all, if Bismarck used ideas of liberating the oppressed and defending smaller nations' rights to justify invading Schleswig-Holstein, he'd have to find a really good reason for sticking around to occupy those places himself, instead of just leaving again. He had been setting up these dominoes for a while, though. There would be no repeat of the last time when they had to flee due to other powers coming in on the side of the Danes. He had already secured the friendship of the Russians, and made vague promises to the French that they might see some territory out of the whole deal if Prussia was allowed to absorb Schleswig and Holstein. And without Russia or France,
That's my
Britain would
grandfather's, man.
protest, but they'd never actually go to war on the Danish side. He had also suckered in Austria,
Man,
convincing
fuck the
them that they
British.
were all on the same side. Germans defending Germans and all that. He even convinced them to be allies and contribute a horde of troops to the effort. And this is key. Not only did he need Austrian troops
see what
to
I'm
secure
saying?
a quick victory, but it would also make them complicit. If after
That's how they
won,
prey on
he
the
said
small
that Prussia
countries,
was
right?
going
They
to
go
take
against us. We
territory,
don't have
the
soldiers
Austrians
enough
wouldn't
to
walk
it.
away without their share,
But it is
which
what it
not
is,
only
man. We
meant
gotta
that
find
European
out.
public opinion wouldn't turn
What the
against
fuck was
Prussia,
shit?
but also meant that he wouldn't lose the moral high ground in the German Confederacy. And his plan worked perfectly. The combined Prussian-Austrian forces rapidly overran Denmark. The Danes had to grant the independence of Schleswig and Holstein. Bismarck made some ludicrous demands, and the Austrians, not wanting to be left out, eventually caved to a compromise that left Bismarck exactly where he actually wanted to be. Prussia would keep Schleswig, the Austrians would get Holstein, and he would get a small pile of other minor concessions to boot. But Bismarck was always a man of large appetites. He didn't come all this way to only get Schleswig. And so, part 2 of the plan commenced. Operation Make Fun of Austrian Incompetence. He played
Come
up
on, man.
everything that went wrong in Holstein, and talked openly about it being a breeding ground for revolutionaries. His sound and fury brought the two nations to the brink of war, but both of their monarchs wanted to avoid such a conflict between brothers. Wilhelm
Brothers, you just
accepted
took
the
over my
possibility
country,
of
now you
war,
think you're
but
brothers?
forbade Bismarck
Fuck yeah.
from explicitly goading the Austrians anymore. But Bismarck's work on that front was already done. He had a backup plan in case war didn't
Nah, I ain't
come.
messing with that. That's my
Bismarck always
country,
had
man.
a backup
I
plan.
ain't messing with
but
that.
he spent most of his time trying to shore up alliances, to make sure that Prussia was ready for the fight his king sort of didn't want. First, the Italians.
Uh-oh,
Victor
the
Emmanuel,
Italians,
the
always
man
fierce
trying
Italians,
to unify
man.
Italy, desperately wanted to take over Venice, which was in Austrian hands.
Venice is a
how
nice
can you
city,
have an
I have to
Italy
say.
with
I
no
wanna
Venice?
go there.
But he was never going to have the strength
Gotta
to
get
fight
the money.
Austria alone. alone, and so Bismarck seized on this, getting him to agree that if Prussia and Austria went to war, the newly formed Italian kingdom would join in for only the small price of one Venice, which Bismarck didn't really want anyway. Next, the French. While not publicly successful in securing the French as allies, Bismarck was dealing with Napoleon III here, a man too clever for his own good by half. Napoleon III, who saw himself as the equal of his famous uncle, but really wasn't, took the only course of action that would get him nothing. He wouldn't support Prussia, but he wouldn't support Austria either. This was just fine by Bismarck. Finally, Bismarck kept pressure on Austria, having Prussian officials meet with Romanians and Magyars, Czechs, and Serbs, any ethnic minority within the Austrian Empire, all in order to make it look like he was building allies and raising legions of revolutionaries ready to revolt the moment the Austrians went to war. But Bismarck's plans were interrupted by one thing he did not factor in. As he walked down the great boulevard Unter den Linden, 2 shots broke the quiet. He whirls. A young man stands before him, revolver in hand. The 51-year-old Bismarck grabs him. 3 more shots ring out as they grapple. Finally, soldiers run up and subdue the young man. As the assassin is hauled off, they check Bismarck for wounds. One finds a hole in his coat, and follows it to find a hole in his waistcoat, which, with some trepidation, he follows to find a hole in Bismarck's shirt. All 5 shots had hit, but every one of them had either only grazed him or bounced off of his ribs. In a moment that history doesn't record, but I think we all know happened, Bismarck simply nodded to the soldier, said, "Iron Chancellor," put on shades, and walked away. Refusing to let one measly assassination attempt get in the way of a good war, Bismarck went right back to work getting the German-speaking world to tear itself apart. And as rumors swirled, the Austrians felt they had to make a move, so they called the Pan-German Diet in Frankfurt to decide the issue of Schleswig and Holstein. The Diet moved against Prussia, but this played right into Bismarck's hand.
Man, that's my country, that's where I live, that's where I grew up.
The Prussian representative read a statement that Bismarck had prepared for just such a moment, declaring the Diet invalid and the German Confederation dissolved. Now it would be war. It would be the northern German states and Prussia against the southern German states and the Austrian Empire. Hundreds of thousands of men were mustered. It could have been a long war, but now the king had in his service a general as capable on the battlefield as Bismarck was in the conference room, General Moltke. The uncle of the General Moltke who will so disastrously lead the German forces into the First World War, this Moltke could not have been more different from his nephew. He was one of the first to see that the modern rifle had made the idea of the frontal charge obsolete. He grasped the importance of railroads for mobilization, and realized that modern armies were too big to be commanded by one man, that plans should be flexible, and subordinates should be allowed to take initiative within them. It was this Moltke who famously said, "Plans never survive contact with the enemy." Moltke led a lightning war.
I mean, it's true. You can have a plan, but the plan is probably going to fail. You know what I mean?
And now, where Bismarck had once had to work so hard to get the king to go to war, their success had been so great that he had to work equally hard to get the king to stop. Bismarck realized that
Bismarck is a crazy guy, man.
Far before the other great powers stepped in, and all of the work that he had done would be undone. More still, he believed that once he had eclipsed them, he might need the Austrians to serve as a balance against one of the other great powers, so he must not impose on them a peace that would leave them hating Prussia. So Bismarck called in his erstwhile enemy, the Crown Prince, the same Frederick Wilhelm who he had so unsuccessfully tried to put on the throne as a toddler, and put him to work reining in his father. Fritz, a lover of peace despite being an excellent military commander, convinced the king to accept the deal that Bismarck had on the table. Prussia would take over most of northern Germany. The German Confederation as a body would be disbanded. Their Italian allies would get Venice, and Austria would forever be banned from any pan-German parliament, or from meddling in German affairs. Oh, and weirdly, Liechtenstein became an independent country, so that also. All in all, things were looking up for Bismarck's grand project of uniting all of Germany under Prussian rule. There just loomed one more obstacle, one great nation that, although neutral so far, would oppose any further increase in German unity and strength. There was the problem of France.
Wow, that's crazy. That's a beautiful ass video, man. I really do understand it, man. It's nice. What is going on, everybody? Welcome back We're gonna continue with Extra History Part 5, Otto von Bismarck. So let's just get into this one and see what it's all about. We left off by the French, so let's see what they do. Let's go.
Hey folks, before we start, allow me to introduce our newest Extra History artist, Nick. He'll be taking over for David, who is now hard at work on our new Extra Sci-Fi series. Say hello. Any increase in power brings an increase in enemies. But to Bismarck, enemies were as useful as friends. With the defeat of Austria and the consolidation of the northern German states into one hegemony ruled by Prussia, Bismarck's eye turned to the next problem: founding Germany. But to do this, he would need to bring all of the southern German states under his control. He knew he couldn't simply annex them by force. He needed a unified Germany, a Germany that felt like a country, not some occupied territory under a foreign rule. And for that, the southern German states would have to come to him willingly, of their own volition. But they had always been aligned with Austria, so how could he get them to volunteer to be absorbed into Prussia? He would need an external.
He's gonna figure something out, guaranteed.
That would make these states more afraid of other nations, and see Prussia as the benevolent protector and cultural brother that they could turn to in their time of need. And what better enemy than France? Napoleon III, who had been willing to stand by and let Prussia pick off its neighbors back when it was a minor power, suddenly woke up and realized that a power to rival France had just emerged on its border. Already upset about the fact that he hadn't gotten any territory as a bribe for staying neutral in the war between Prussians and Austrians, Napoleon was primed and ready for a conflict with Prussia. But there was a problem. Both Prussia and France needed the other one to be the aggressor. Neither wanted to risk international rebuke or the possibility of foreign intervention in their cause.
Of course
not. But Bismarck had a plan. Bismarck always had a plan. His plan was wait until circumstances presented themselves that allowed him to formulate an advantageous plan. So he did. Then, when the Queen of Spain was suddenly kicked out of Spain by revolutionaries, Bismarck knew it was go time. Because when a European monarch vacates their throne, there is always a multinational scramble for succession. In this case, you'd think it would be less complicated because the Spanish kicked out their monarch and were essentially choosing a new one for themselves instead of trying to untangle and war over some Byzantine genealogical tree. But no, they instead decided to offer the crown of Spain to a German prince. Bismarck was all for this. He pushed for Prince Leopold to accept the offer, despite the fact that his name didn't even have Wilhelm in it anywhere. He knew full well that Napoleon III would have to rage against this offer. After all, if Spain ever allied with Prussia, which would be far more likely with a Prussian prince on the Spanish throne, France would be surrounded. King Wilhelm was against this, and even Prince Leopold didn't see great prospects in being king of a country that had spent most of the last century in revolt, but Bismarck's diplomacy prevailed, and the offer was accepted. All of these dealings were kept a very close secret, though. If France found out too early, the consequences could be disastrous. What Bismarck needed was for Leopold to be proclaimed king by the legitimate assembly of the people of Spain before Napoleon could make a move. That way, if France declared war over it, the world would see them as the aggressors. Everything went perfectly. On June 19, 1870, Leopold agreed to accept the throne. 2 days later, he sent a coded telegraph to Madrid saying that he would arrive around the 29th. But then history turned, as it so often does, on a small thing. A cipher clerk made an error in decoding the message and wrote the 9th of July. The Spanish legislature couldn't be held in session that long, and thus was dismissed on June 23rd, which meant that when Leopold arrived in Spain, there was nobody present to make him king. People started noticing this Prussian prince kicking around in Madrid fairly quickly, and word reached the French papers. Soon, all of France was up in arms.
Of course.
So not everything went perfectly. But Bismarck now played the spider, waiting silently. He knew that he couldn't be seen directing affairs. All he had to do was wait for the French to offer some insult, and then pounce on that to have the war he wanted. But he didn't factor in Wilhelm. The king had always been opposed to the prince running off and taking the Spanish throne, so when the French outcry flared up, the Prussian monarch put his foot down and told Leopold to withdraw his nomination. This was a huge diplomatic win for France, but like always, Napoleon III pushed it too far. He sent a diplomat to ask Wilhelm to swear that no Hohenzollern would ever sit on the Spanish throne. The king found this mildly insulting, as there was no way he would promise something like that in perpetuity. And besides, he had already pulled Leopold from the throne, and it wasn't likely to come up again. He felt that he had already been perfectly reasonable about this. So he replied that he could promise no such thing, and sent the French ambassador away. Then he had a quick telegram sent to Bismarck relaying the incident and granting him permission to inform the press. But Bismarck always had a way with vague instructions, and with words. He did indeed inform the press, but the message he passed along to them was carefully edited. It wasn't false, per se. It wasn't even really a misrepresentation. He just omitted some words. Omitted some words in such a brilliant way that when the German people read it, they would think the French ambassador had insulted their king. And when the French read it, they would think that the Prussian king had insulted their ambassador. That did the trick.
That's crazy.
The people were up in arms.
How can you do that? That's amazing,
Paris
man.
all the more so because, coincidentally, the telegram happened to come out on Bastille Day. And Napoleon III needed a war. His regime was largely unsuccessful, and his foreign entanglements had been a disaster. He thought that if he could crush Prussia and gain territory for France, he would be back on stable footing. Soon, hundreds of thousands of French troops were pouring across the Prussian border. Bismarck had his defensive war. The French had invaded, and he had the moral high ground. In response, the southern German states flocked to the Prussian banner, but he played a dangerous game. By letting the French invade the Prussians, he had allowed them to mobilize first. Now the German army had to get into position before their country was overrun. But here, Bismarck had the greatest weapon, Moltke. The French had better rifles than the Germans, but the Germans had better ideas about modern war. Prussian observers had studied the American Civil War and knew that a train schedule could be as powerful a tool as any gun. Moltke embraced the idea of the railroad and the telegraph. With coordination and these new technologies for movement, he not only got the German army to the front in time, he got more men there than the French did.
Wow.
But he did more than just this. He rewrote the rules so that German units no longer simply marched in great columns and fought in great lines, but rather acted as small units less susceptible to fire. He pushed the idea that, since piercing the center of an army was no longer as much of a concern due to the deadly nature of modern rifles, they should worry less about artillery getting overrun and more about how effective it was in a fight. So he moved his artillery closer to the action and had them working in conjunction with his units. He had a general staff, the only one in Europe, whose sole purpose was to draw up war plans in peacetime and think through all of the probable scenarios of coming conflicts.
That's crazy.
With these advantages and a superiority in numbers, Moltke immediately took the offensive, rapidly pushing the French back across the border and charging into French territory. Time and again, the French reeled before the Prussian forces. Soon, the French armies were falling back, trying to link up with reserves further down the line. But the retreating army was spotted by a small cavalry brigade, and nearby Prussian forces were ordered to move in and cut them off. Unfortunately, due to some wild miscalculations by both sides, the Prussians had just sent 30,000 men to engage what turned out to be 130,000. The French were beleaguered and demoralized, but had an overwhelming advantage in men. The Prussians were ready for the fight, but ended up pinned by the French artillery. In desperation, the Prussian commander sent a message to a nearby cavalry commander, saying that the artillery must be cleared. Famously, the cavalry commander said, "It will cost what it will cost," and readied his men. Obscured by the terrain, they burst through the cannon smoke at the last minute, bearing down on the foe, giving them only 1,000 meters to react. The cavalry crashed into the artillery and tore through it, silencing the batteries that had so long hampered the Prussian army. This is arguably the last cavalry charge to significantly change the course of a battle in modern military history.
That's
but
crazy.
even 1,000 meters is a long ride when you've got modern guns firing at you.
True.
Of the 800 horsemen who set out, only 420 made it back. And it turns out that Bismarck's son was among this regiment. It was late in the night of August 16, 1870, when a messenger arrived to tell Bismarck his eldest son was dead. Quartered only 20 miles away from the battlefield, Bismarck rode like a man possessed to find the body of his son, only to be greeted by his very much alive son laughing and joking in a farmhouse nearby. He had taken a bullet to the leg and would be out of the fighting, but was in no mortal danger. After a few more hard-fought victories, the Prussian forces bottled up the French at Metz and forced the surrender of 140,000 men. The French only had one army left to them, an army battered by an attempt to relieve the forces at Metz. But Moltke had no intention of letting this force get away, and in the days following the surrender at Metz, he maneuvered his forces and encircled this final
crazy.
army.
This guy's a good man. He's a good general.
So exhausted and undersupplied were the French at this point, it soon became clear that a breakout was impossible. By the next day, 100,000 men, and with them the greatest prize of all, Napoleon III, who was personally leading this army, surrendered. France no longer had a real army on the field. Now it was time to think about the future. For Bismarck, that meant peace terms. For Moltke,
now he wants peace. Okay.
Paris.
Well, as always, man, that was a good-ass video, man. But we have one last episode left, and we're just gonna go into it and see what it's all about, man. It's amazing that this guy's actually like this, but because of the generals, normally kings and all these people in power, they normally win because of their generals. But, yeah, it is what it is, man. But it's really amazing that Prussia actually made it this far. That's crazy, man. But anyway, without further ado, let's just get into the last one. Let's go.
The Prussian army reigned victorious. 250,000 men had surrendered to them, and the French emperor was their prisoner.
That's a lot of men.
It was time to make peace. There was only one problem.
Uh-oh. There's one problem.
You see, capturing an emperor sounds great. It sounds like the thing that happens when you win. But when the emperor is the state, and he's also your prisoner, who do you negotiate with?
Exactly.
This was the problem Bismarck was facing. Too much winning. He wanted to make peace, but they had won so much that he couldn't figure out who to make peace with. So when the news reached Paris on September 2nd, 1870, one of the remaining generals and a few French statesmen declared themselves the government, which they cleverly named the Government of National Defense. Of course, the emperor was technically still alive and had never abdicated, which was
but it is what it is, man. They need to do something. What they want to do.
So where did their legitimacy come from? Well, everybody basically agreed nowhere. This slapdash government maintained some semblance of control by delivering strong speeches about how France wouldn't give up an inch of territory, to which Bismarck responded, Alsace and Lorraine, please. Negotiations with this pseudo-government quickly fell apart. Moltke was pretty stoked. This meant he would get to march on Paris after all. As the Prussians approached the French capital, the Government of National Defense recalled all of France's armed forces from their colonies, their holdings in Italy, and summoned them to the defense of the homeland. Soon they had a formidable force at Paris, at least on paper, and they began to dig in. But Moltke simply surrounded the capital and laid siege to it. One of the main members of the Government of National Defense pieced out via air balloon to see if he could raise an army in Loire. Everybody else stayed put, defenses raised, just waiting for Moltke to try to storm the city. Moltke had no intention of doing something so blindingly wasteful, though. Instead, he planned to simply let Paris starve and wait them out while the rest of Germany's forces patrolled France, crushing whatever other armies the French put in the field. Bismarck argued that they should shell the city, something that Moltke and the general staff felt was inhumane, against the rules of war, and probably ineffective anyway. But as time wore on, Wilhelm got impatient with the rising costs of this siege and ordered Moltke to listen to Bismarck. There is much debate about how much effect the guns had, and whether it was the shelling or just the starvation that led to surrender, but at last, the Government of National Defense signed an armistice. During these peace negotiations, the representative of the Government of National Defense pleaded with Bismarck, saying that if Paris acceded to all demands, it would cause a socialist revolution. Bismarck coolly replied, "Then I recommend provoking an uprising now while you still have an army to crush it." Outplayed at every turn, the Government of National Defense gave Bismarck basically everything he wanted.
Bismarck is a smart guy, I just have to say. I hate him, but he's a smart
villages
guy.
and towns, adding 1.5 million new souls to the German Empire. He got 5 billion francs in gold to be paid as indemnity, and Prussian troops would be staying in France until that was paid, just in case some real French government came along and tried to go back on their deal. Oh, and also, Bismarck got a German empire.
Wow, that's crazy.
More specifically, he forced the French to officially acknowledge Wilhelm as Kaiser, or Emperor, of Germany, the last real step in the unification process. Back when the war first started, the southern German states, the last holdouts, had sort of been absorbed into this growing entity which Bismarck had been putting together.
That is actually crazy that Russia took over 3 times the world almost. You know what I mean? Like, that's crazy.
Side by side with Prussians. It had given them a sense of unity and brotherhood that eclipsed their regional differences, made them an army of Germans fighting together. So now, as the war wound to a close, after experiencing such a great victory through cooperation, these states all voted to become part of something greater, something called the German Empire. Finally, in a scene full of spectacle and drama, on January 18th, 1871, the leading military commanders declared Wilhelm Kaiser in the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles. And so the glory of war and the pomp and circumstance of imperial dignity played out. Now all that was left was creating a constitution, which Bismarck expedited by convincing the newly formed German Empire to simply adopt most of northern Germany's previous constitution.
Of course, he's so lazy.
One interesting proviso. All ministries were under the office of Chancellor, and the Chancellor could propose legislation or bring things to debate in any of the parliamentary houses. But the chancellorship itself was granted at the direct pleasure of the king. No other body could remove a chancellor or appoint one. Coincidentally, Bismarck just so happened to be the Chancellor of Germany. But even with this broad power over his newly formed empire, even now that he was finally ascendant in Germany and Europe at large, Bismarck now faced a challenge that he had never truly had to deal with before: the challenge of governing. Most of Bismarck's life had been focused on unification, on expansion, and on foreign policy. He'd never before really had to focus on questions of domestic policy for Germany. A new Germany, one sewn together out of disparate people of different backgrounds and different faiths.
That's gonna explode.
And here perhaps would be his greatest challenge, because now he had to ensure the continued meteoric rise of this new German empire, while at the same time fending off the jealousies of Europe's existing great powers, so that they didn't band together and crush this fledgling nation. This Herculean effort would take him the rest of his life, and for all of its difficulties, would be the triumph of his foreign policy and his political philosophy of revolutionary conservatism.
That's crazy.
But if Bismarck had one great failing, one true tragedy to his life, it would be that he could not envision a world without Bismarck. At least not until it was far too late.
Oh, okay.
And so all of this effort, all of this work he did to ensure a strong but peaceful future
it
for
doesn't
Germany
really hold
would
up, that's
wash
why.
away in other leaders' hands,
exactly.
feeding directly into the looming catastrophes of 1914. But that's a story for another time. Thanks for watching.
That is crazy. Let's pause here, man. That's amazing, man. That was the end of Bismarck, Otto von Bismarck. I finally reacted to everything, and I just want to say, man, wow, this guy's amazing. He did so many things, but I hated him because he invaded Denmark and Schleswig-Holstein, or whatever the fuck they're called. It's just crazy, man. It's really crazy to see this little guy coming from nothing and actually taking over half of Europe. You know what I mean? Like, that's the crazy part of it. Like, he actually is a smart guy, but this guy could not have won without his generals, because his generals was the war front of everything. Like, they made sure that he had victory. That is crazy. That is very nice. But this Bismarck, he actually thought about taking over the European, like Germany, unifying Germany and everything, but he never really tried to conquer with land. You know what I mean? Like, he never really tried to government like a people. So he has to work and work and work, just, you know, as they say at the end, so other leaders, they can come and everything is washed away. That is the crazy part of it, and unfortunately, it is the real thing. You can put work into something that is just gonna go away in like 5 minutes or an hour or something like that. It's just crazy to see, man. But anyway, guys, I really did enjoy these parts right here, and I'm really happy about it. So I wanted to react to every single part, because then it's done and then it's gone, and then I have the history. It's really nice to see. I really do enjoy this history. So yeah, but without further ado, if you like this video, please hit the like button down below. If you want to support the channel, please do subscribe. We almost at 200 subscribers, and it's just amazing to see that you people are beautiful supporting us and me, and I really do appreciate that. But anyway, guys, I'm gonna see you until the next video. Peace.